Well, I wanted to say two thank yous before I began my presentation. The first thank you is to Noel and the whole Punto y Raya team, because not only have they organized a wonderful event, but to support this kind of work in this way is so crucial and important, because it can be very sort of lonely to do this kind of work. And so having community and support with things like Punto y Raya is really important. And the second thank you I wanted to make was, you mentioned before Amy's presentation, Jules Engle. And I actually wanted to mention that it was such a nice reminder to mention him, because Jules Engle was my teacher. He was Amy Kravitz's teacher. And we met there studying with him at California Institute of the Arts back in the 80s. And Jules was a very special man, so I just wanted to take a moment to thank him. He's no longer with us, but his spirit is with us. He was a man who was able to bridge the generation of experimental animators and filmmakers like Oskar Fischinger, and brought that aesthetic and approach to filmmaking to generations of young people studying with him. So he really acted as he was like a one-person bridge that created this connection. And I know I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be making films if it weren't for Jules. He was also an incredible teacher. So I have to just also thank Jules. I hope he can hear me anyway. So in my talk, I'm going to show you my films, or a selection of my films. They're all pretty short. So there's going to be a number of them. And they're not in chronological order, because what I thought I would do in thinking about this was to talk about the process of getting to the film. So I started out actually intending to be a painter, and I studied painting for a couple of years, and then left art school because for whatever reasons, I became disenchanted with painting. Although I love painting, I was disenchanted with going to art school to study painting. So I went to a university, studied other subjects, ended up in film. And while I was a film student, I took a couple of animation courses almost by accident. One was with John Whitney Sr., another was with another teacher there at UCLA in California. And when I took those courses, I suddenly realized that animation could be a way of coming back into a kind of painting, but now it was a painting practice that actually had the element of time as well as sound. And suddenly I became really interested again in making images. It's like I found a language. And one of the things about animation that really attracted me was the fact that no one image mattered. With painting, I became very overwhelmed with the pressure of a blank canvas. But with animation, I had to make 12 to 24 images for every second. So I didn't have to worry so much about what I did on any one particular frame. And that actually was really important. And it does relate to what I wanted to talk about today. Because I realized that I've created a series of sort of techniques almost for getting past the kind of barriers that we make for ourselves when we're making creative work. Sometimes we actually have to create methods for getting past those. And so that's a little bit what I wanted to talk about today, was some of those methods of getting past the obstacles that are all self-created. So I called it Unexpected Paths because I don't actually know where I'm going when I start a film. In fact, I don't even know when I've started a film. because what I do is I just work, I just make things all the time. And some of them become films, some of them have not yet become films, some of them will never become films, is my guess. But I save things because I don't necessarily know what I'm even doing at the time. I'm just making things. And then later, I might put it aside, and later, even a year or two later, I might take it out and look at it and realize that I was doing something and I had no idea. So that's an example of an unexpected path. What I'm always looking for in the work is a kind of poetic center. So my films, even the ones that have sort of characters and situations in them, are not really narrative. They're actually sort of like they're sort of like circling a central poetic idea, and the process of making the film is the process of finding that poetic center. So so that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about. And when I was trying to think of a kind of metaphor for how to talk about this, I was thinking about Henry David Thoreau, who was a poet, a philosopher, a writer, a naturalist, part of the Transcendentalist movement in late 19th century America. And he actually lived not far from where I live now. He lived in Concord, Massachusetts. I live about an hour south of there. And he's best known for this book about living for a year in the woods near Walden Pond. I've walked around Walden Pond, and it's a beautiful place, and they have a sort of a whole, information about Thoreau. But his writing influenced a lot of people in different ways, and I find it very evocative. And so I thought actually I'd dip back into Thoreau for a couple of ideas to help guide me through this talk. He was primarily a writer, and he gave lectures. And one of the lectures that he gave, which was also an essay, he developed over actually most of his life, was called Walking. And it was about the process of walking through the natural environment and experiencing it. And this seemed in some ways to me like the creative journey, at least that I face when I create work. So there were three concepts in particular that I took from him, and in particular this essay called Walking. One was the idea of sauntering. So walking is the act of putting one foot in front of the other. It describes the kind of physical process of walking. Sauntering is a little bit the attitude with which one walks. And the idea of sauntering is that you're moving at a relaxed pace, and that you're experiencing the process of walking. You're looking at the world around you. You're thinking about what you're seeing. So that's one idea. Another idea is the idea of the unknown. So he says, we require that there be an unknown. And I think he's right about that. And so making a film for me is always about venturing into unknown territory. And it really has to be unknown in order to become anything. And the last idea is this quote, which is a very famous quote of his: "In wildness is the preservation of the world." And it's been interpreted in a lot of different ways. But I think it's a really interesting quote, because the first one is a verb. It's sauntering. It's the act of walking without a necessary destination. The second word is a noun. It's a place in which we travel and maybe get lost in. And the third is an attitude. Wildness as an attitude. And that's actually was the most important concept to me when I was thinking about Thoreau, was this attitude of wildness. So when I was thinking about how I work, I was thinking about what that attitude of wildness is, because I think it's appropriate in describing at least my creative process. So this is just a separation between one thing and another. So, but that's just to get us started. We're on our way. So I wanted to try to actually define what these things mean, because I realized that they actually do, in some way, define the way that I work, or the attitude with which I work. So the first idea I wanted to break down was this idea of wildness. And I was thinking, well, what is wildness? And I think I am interpreting it in a way that perhaps Thoreau didn't intend, but what I was thinking of as an attitude of wildness is an attitude of allowing things to be what they are, that don't depend on your defining them. In other words, it's something that exists outside of you, it's something over which you actually don't have any control, and you have an encounter with it. So when you go into nature and you walk around and you experience, a landscape or a creature, or a river, or whatever it is that you're experiencing, you didn't create it. You're encountering it, and you had to enter that area in order to experience it. So my films are really basically made with this attitude of wildness. So wildness, not in the sense of running around, with my clothes off, but with the attitude of like allowing what I'm making to appear to me without my having to define it. And often I can't even define it afterward, but definitely not while I'm in the process of trying to discover it. And so by doing that, I'm hoping to get to a kind of poetic center, and that's what I'm always looking for. So there were these four things: instinct and impulse, I thought, as one category of what constitutes the attitude of wildness. Accident and chance is another. Purposeless play as a third, and intrinsic structure is a fourth. So I'm going to show you a couple of films under each of these categories as I go through them. So the first one I wanted to talk about was instinct and impulse, and this is sort of the beginning of the process. And I was thinking, well, what's instinct and impulse? And I was thinking that perhaps what it is a process of, first of all, noticing your reactions to things. Even just your physical reactions to things. Are there things that actually get your blood flowing a little faster, or excite you, or spark curiosity? And then where do your thoughts go about that? What does an inspiration cause you to actually begin thinking about, and to actually pay attention to what your reactions and your thoughts are, and then to respond to it. So not just simply having that experience, but also then engaging with it by responding through making something, which is actually where the process of making artwork comes in. So this is a short film I'll show you that in some way relates to this theme. So that film grew out of basically an accident, And in fact, that's how almost everything I make is made, is actually from something I didn't intend. And very often it's when I'm trying to make something and I'm frustrated with it that I accidentally do something else, and then I just forget what I was trying to do and make the thing that was the accident. So that happened in this case. I was working on another film idea, and I was getting very frustrated. So just, I had ink, India ink, and I had a rag, and I was working with brushes, but I was just frustrated. So I took the ink, I poured it on the rag, and I just made a kind of slashing gesture on a piece of paper. And then I looked at it and realized it was actually really interesting. So then I forgot what I was doing with the other film and just laid out paper on the floor, sheet after sheet after sheet. And I had a mat, this cardboard mat already, and I just thought, okay, well, I'm going to contain it so that I know where the frame edges are. And I just took the mat and went down one at a time, just painting, almost like an action painting, but in time, over a sequence of about 80 sheets, and with no intention of animation. Just it was just sort of like a physical memory. And so my reaction here was that when I was frustrated and just let myself go, I realized that I made something I was interested in, and I liked this sort of almost abstract expressionist gesture of the ink on the paper. So I just continued doing that and made lots and lots of sequences, and I just organized them in the order that I made them. I wasn't trying to make them into animation. But, and that's a close-up of what one of them looked like. And when I looked at these individually, I liked not only the image in the middle, but I liked the edges where the ink was bleeding around the mat. And that was also something I hadn't obviously intended, but it was something that I was interested in, and I was thinking, well, maybe there's something in that too. So I brought those ink paintings into Photoshop, I layered them, and I think a theme that's come up numerous times over the week is the blending modes. And I don't know if it was Paul who first said that they were underrated, and I think he's right. They're definitely underrated. Blending modes are very simple to use, and they produce unexpected and interesting results. So I was layering these with blending modes and getting even more interesting images out of them. But they were still horizontal at that point, like that. And I didn't really know what to do with them at that point. I showed them to my wife, artist collaborator, Amy Kravitz, and she said, well, why don't you try turning it 90 degrees? So I did, and then there was room for another one. And then once there were two images up there, then that was when I realized I had a poetic idea. So up until then, I had been sort of following my reactions, but when I saw the two up there together, then I knew what I wanted to do, and I found the poetic center. And in this case, it was the idea of a dialogue, a conversation, a dance, an argument between these two shapes. And then that's how I could then construct this short film, was with this idea of the two having an interaction with each other. So that's how I actually organized and created the animation for it. So that's an example of noticing my reactions and following the thoughts. So that's why I put it under this category. I'm going to show another one now. This is another short film, and then I can talk briefly about it afterward. that was another film that grew out of a moment of frustration. Again, I was working on another film that I really couldn't move any further with. And so in frustration, and I was very frustrated, I picked up a piece of black cardboard that was just sitting on my desk. And I had a down shooter, for shooting animation, so it was a camera pointing down and 2 lights on the side. And I just picked up the cardboard and just started shaking it under the camera. Like I said, I was frustrated. But then I noticed that there were interesting shadows and shapes being made by the black cardboard when it was on its side. And so, again, just like the last film, I forgot what I was doing with this other thing that I had intended to make and ended up making something that I had no intention of making. So I got very fascinated by that edge and by the shadows. So I just took 5 frames of that, maybe it was 8, I can't remember, 5 or 8 frames of that while I was just moving it. Just took like a little 8-frame burst of time lapse, moving it back and forth, so it was a sort of jittery motion. And then the entire film was just made from those 5 or 8 frames. There was no additional artwork made. It was just those 5 to 8 frames. And I just really enjoyed figuring out what you could do with those 8 frames of that jittery shape and the shadows it was making. So I just did that in After Effects. I just kept layering it in different ways, again using blending modes, and looking for interesting ideas. And then what I came to as the kind of central sort of emotive idea of this film was the idea of grief and longing. So that's what I was sort of intending, and it sort of moves between a sort of loneliness and a kind of hopeful middle, and then a kind of loneliness at the end. So that was in this case, that was the first film was really about 2 entities having an interaction, and this film was really about one entity being alone, but longing for something else. So again, I found the poetic idea, the center of the film, through noticing my reactions to the cardboard, and then developing that until I could find the film. But again, I wasn't trying to make a film. I was just reacting to this piece of cardboard and what it did with the light. So that was the first category. The second category is accident and chance. And again, like I said in the beginning, I think much of what I do is an attempt to get past myself and to allow the work to come out rather than getting in the way of it. And so I've often had to invent techniques for doing that, because it's hard to trick yourself. So you have to really invent things to do so. So that's where the second category comes in, of accident and chance. I actually develop techniques for creating accidents, and that's often using elements of chance, things that I can't predict. And so for me, I was thinking, well, what does that mean? And one thing it means is having no preconceptions, just following the kind of rule for accidents that I've created, and not judging the outcome, but just allowing whatever happens to happen. Like I said, inventing ways to make those accidents, and then looking for the surprises. So first, you don't edit anything out, and then you look for the things that are really, really promising and growing. So it's not really a process of winnowing away. It's more a process of watering and allowing what's best in your accidental products to continue to grow. I'll show another film and talk about how it relates to that theme. And this film is not abstract visually. It does have characters. It has, but I think it's interesting to show some of the representational work I do in the context of the abstract work, because really the approach is very similar in terms of looking for the center. The limitation I created for myself in order to generate something was to just use like 2 or 3 pages from a sketchbook. Well, it was more than 2 or 3. I guess it was 5 or 6. But anyway, it was a certain number of pages out of sketches that I had made long before, with absolutely no intention of ever doing anything with them. But I just took them out and said, okay, I'm just going to make something with these. So I had to actually figure out how to create animation, characters, a kind of narrative arc, but all from the limited sources that I was giving myself to work with. So, again, I wouldn't have made that film without giving myself that limitation and task. And here's a second example of this kind of approach of creating limitations in order to get to an idea. This is called Strange Fish.
One other question I don't has career goals 12, so I guess in necessity is taking a step backwards. And 9.
That film actually came from a kind of response I had to reading a book about evolution written by Stephen Jay Gould called Wonderful Life, and it's about the exploration of this fossil record in Canada, the Burgess Shale, and what they found in the fossil record was this evidence that about 450 million years ago, there was a huge and sudden, well, geologically speaking, a huge and sudden explosion of life on Earth that had not existed before. So the Earth had a few life forms on it before, but they were very limited. And then, because of whatever conditions, life just exploded into many different forms. And it was a time of experimentation in evolution where some life forms didn't continue on and others did continue on and were the result of that. And I got really interested in this idea of how accidental, in a way, evolution is, where it's not actually moving towards a goal, but is just a series of contingencies that create evolution. So I was researching that, and I was looking at the fossils. That's just a diagram of the explosion of life. But I also was looking at all of these fossils, and they're really beautiful. I love the shapes of the animals, and I love the textures of the rocks that they were in. And so I began drawing them. Again, I wasn't intending to make a film. I was just exploring something that was evocative to me. And so I just started drawing, these animals, trying to imagine them, and they were really interesting, but that was only interesting so far. But then what I did, just on a whim, was I started drawing them with my eyes closed, and began to get some really interesting variations on the representational image. So these blind drawings became really interesting to me, and I just kept doing them until I had quite a lot. And yeah, and then what I did was I opened my eyes. So I had my eyes closed for about a month, and then I opened them, and then I just began in-betweening with my eyes open between these different blind drawings to create these wavy transformations between each of the animals. So this is like examples of some of the drawings that I made in the process. And then I put them together, these sequences of animation, shot them, put them together, and began editing them. And there were a couple of things that really came through to me. One was that these drawings were like my fossils in the sediment of the paper, just as those animals were fossils in the sediment of the earth. I just thought that was an interesting sort of corollary. So what that meant that when I shot the film, I was trying to emphasize the fact that these ink drawings were actually part of the paper. So, scanning over, having the camera move over the surface of the paper and coming to an animal was my attempt at trying to create that sense that the ink on paper was a kind of corollary to the fossil record, and that my method of drawing with my eyes closed was actually a corollary to the blindness of evolution. So those are some examples of how I created limitational structures, either by limiting the number of pieces of artwork I can use to make a film, or by creating a rule for myself in the way that I make the artwork, like by keeping my eyes closed. The next category, purposeless play, is just basically, again, using limitations, because it's hard to play without limitations. You actually need some kind of rules within which to play. Then being curious about what you're making, actually finding the things that do spark your curiosity, and again, being non-judgmental. I have a couple of films to sort of related to this category, and this is one of them. So that film, the limitation, the sandbox that I was playing in was a drawing. It wasn't actually this drawing because I couldn't find it, but it was a drawing like this. I just drew a bunch of letter forms, sort of abstracted and letter forms on a piece of paper, and that one piece of paper then became all the artwork in the film, and the rest of it was playing with those. So that was an example of giving yourself a place within which to play, and maybe that's why I was working with the idea of a boy. And a corollary to that is this film, which I'm going to show right away. The limitation there was that there was this one drawing of a ballerina made by my daughter Hannah, who's in the audience. She studied ballet intensively, and she drew that, I think maybe in response to all the practicing that she was doing. But the drawing had this really great character to it, and so the limitation I gave myself was I was going to, one, base a film on that one drawing, and then two, every single character shape that appears in that film is actually taken from either her childhood drawings or her sister's childhood drawings. So that was the limitation there. And again, it was a kind of playground within which I created the animation. And again, I had no intention of where I was going with it. I've never had an intention of where I'm going. And if I ever have had an intention of where I'm going, I've never finished the film. The last category I wanted to mention was this idea of intrinsic structure. So when you're trying to figure out what you're doing, you're making things and you're trying to figure out what you're doing, one of the things that happens is that you begin to find a kind of internal logic to the thing that you're making. So you might find that the images that you're creating or the animation that you're creating begins to take on a kind of structure that then reveals or supports the idea that you're working toward. But you don't necessarily have that structure in mind at the beginning, at least I don't. Just sort of creating loosely, improvisationally, and then eventually finding connections between things, working through the process of editing to see what those structures actually are, because when you put two shots next to each other, maybe they work, maybe they suggest something, maybe they don't work, and you try something else, and then you realize, this is what the artwork is actually doing. But you need to do the process of the editing to find that internal logic to the film. And so I'm going to show a couple of films. This one, the sort of logic that came out of making the artwork was the idea of a void. So emptiness and trying to fill the emptiness was what the kind of logic that I came to in making this film. The idea of the film, the kind of internal logic of the film, came out of the fact that I had drawn all these parts of bodies, and then when not intending to put them together, I had drawn them for others, just drawn them. But then when I actually assembled them together, and there was no torso, there was no actual body, there were just the appendages, then that became the logic of the film, this absolutely unfillable void in the center of the character. So that was the internal logic that drove that film. And these are just some images of, I looked at pigs, looked at auctions of livestock in America, rural America. These are some of the body parts that I had made at various times. I didn't make them at the same time. And then putting them together into this void character was the logic of the film. And then this film is also another example, I think, in a way, of this idea of looking for intrinsic structure or internal logic to the film. That film actually started as a commission to create animation for an opera bouffe, a two-act comedic opera. The music was by Darius Milhaud, an early 20th century composer, and it was based on a Purim play, which tells the story of Queen Esther. The funding did not come through for the opera, but so I made it into a film. And the story of Queen Esther, it's a comic story, it's in the Jewish canon, and it basically tells the story about how Queen Esther ends up saving the Jews of Persia from destruction through a series of court intrigues with the king and the evil minister Haman. One of the things that was interesting to me, or two of the things that were interesting to me about this was the idea that, so that's an actual scroll that tells the story of Esther, and it's always read from a scroll. So it's pulled out, and it travels from left to right as you're reading it. And then as you're reading it, when you come to various scenes in the story, there are kinds of decorations that create frames and vignettes around that part of the story. So I wanted to create an animation that had that internal structure to it, that had the idea of moving from left to right and the idea of these circular vignettes. So that's what I did, is I created all the movements of that film from scene to scene is always moving from left to right. And then when you stop at a point, you're looking at the story through the vignette of the leaves. And then, in addition, that kind of made it all need to be in a tree. And a further idea, again, that kind of has a logic attached to the story, is that the leaves of the tree are blown by the wind. So they don't actually have any agency of their own. They're just controlled by this invisible force. And in the story of Esther, God never appears, but there's implications in the story that God is actually behind all of the events. So that was another kind of intrinsic structure that I was trying to create through my methods in the film. The next section I wanted to talk about, and the last section, was sound. I make all my soundtracks. I collage them from various sources. Some of them are sources, that I record, and others are sources I find. But I collage them all to create the soundtracks. I also make the soundtracks after I finish the picture, so the picture is completely finished before I begin the sound. So the sound then becomes almost like a second making of the film. The sound is also really important because it creates meaning in the picture. So the picture has a life of its own, but the sound actually creates a whole nother dimension of meaning to the sound. And I think one of the reasons I do the sound after the picture is because it takes me the length of time of making the picture to figure out what the film is actually about. And then I can go back in the soundtrack and support or contradict or emphasize certain parts of the film that I think are, need that kind of emphasis. So I think that's why I make the sound second, is because it takes me the entire making of the picture to figure out what it is that I'm actually making. So this film that I'm going to end with is called Line, and the whole film was made just from 5 lines that I drew and then, shot to make one little clip of animation. The whole film is just made from that one little sequence. So in that, it's like Edge, where I gave myself very strict limitations within which to make a film. And then when I went back with the sound, it began to mean something even more to me. So. It's not one of the 4 categories, but sound is sort of in a category of its own, I think. And in that case, I felt that I really kind of gave a kind of soul to the film when I began to work on the sound for it. And so I'll just end with this thought from Thoreau. Not till we are completely lost or turned around do we begin to find ourselves. That's a little bit the theme of what I'm talking about, which is the idea that you can't direct yourself. I'm really speaking to myself here, but I can't direct myself with any kind of pre-planned destination. I really need to enter this uncharted territory. I need to allow anything to happen, and I then play in that area with what I'm finding, and then I begin to look for the internal meaning or logic or structure in the materials I'm playing with and that I'm making, and then I begin to put it together, and only then do I figure out what it is that I'm actually making. So the making of the film is the process of finding the film. So I'll end with that thought.